You will encounter people in your life who will look at you and say, "You can't do it." They won't always say it directly. Sometimes it's subtle, a smirk when you share your plans, a dismissive shrug, or that awkward silence when you talk about your dreams. That silence can be louder than words. It carries the weight of doubt, and if you're not careful, it seeps into you. You start questioning yourself. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not capable. Maybe I'm overreaching. That's how self-doubt begins, not from your own nature, but from the echo of other people's disbelief. But here's the truth. Doubt is a universal experience. Everyone faces it. The only difference is what you do with it. Most people take doubt as a wall. They hit it and stop, thinking that's the end of the road. But the extraordinary ones, the ones who break boundaries, they don't see a wall. They see raw material. They take that doubt, that skepticism, and they use it as fuel. Instead of shrinking under the weight of criticism, they let it harden their resolve psychologically. This is crucial. Human beings are wired for challenge. We thrive when something pushes back against us. Imagine lifting weights. Without resistance, your muscles won't grow. Doubt is the psychological equivalent of resistance training. It's uncomfortable, it burns, it tests you, but if you approach it correctly, it makes you stronger. The people who dismiss you are, in a strange way, your greatest benefactors because they provide you with the resistance you need to grow. I'm not saying you should seek out negativity for its own sake. That's masochism, not growth. What I'm saying is that when negativity comes, and you should train yourself to reinterpret it. Don't hear "you can't" as a prophecy, hear it as a challenge. There's something deeply powerful in transforming the meaning of doubt. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, once argued that the last of human freedoms is the ability to choose your attitude in any given situation. You can't control whether people doubt you, but you can absolutely control whether their doubt becomes poison or power. Think about it. If you accept their doubt as truth, you carry their limitations, not your own. You live inside the smallness of their vision instead of expanding into the fullness of yours. But if you flip it, if you take their disbelief and say to yourself, "I'll show you," then suddenly their doubt is no longer a prison. It's a spark. That's not arrogance. It's transformation. It's taking someone's attempt to cage you and turning it into the very thing that sets you free. There's also a deeper philosophical principle at work here. Nietzsche spoke about the will to power, the idea that human beings are driven by an inner force to expand, to overcome, to rise beyond. When people doubt you, they are often unconsciously presenting you with a limitation. That limitation is not about you, it's about them. It's their ceiling, their boundary. If you accept it, you become a prisoner of their weakness. If you reject it, if you prove them wrong, you actualize that will to power. You transcend not only their expectation, but your own fear. Of course, this is not easy. It requires psychological toughness. When someone you respect doubts you, it can cut deep. Sometimes it's not strangers. Sometimes it's your parents, your friends, your mentors. The people whose opinions matter the most can sometimes become the greatest sources of discouragement. That's painful and it can break you if you let it. But you must remember, love does not always equal vision. People can care about you deeply and still not see what you are capable of. You can't hold their blindness against them, but you also can't allow it to dictate your future. What you need then is to practice reframing. The next time someone dismisses you, instead of collapsing, ask yourself, what if they're wrong? What if their doubt is not a reflection of my limits, but of their inability to imagine something greater? Once you ask that question seriously, you've already taken the first step toward proving them wrong. History is filled with stories of individuals who transformed doubt into fuel. Every revolutionary thinker, every great leader, every artist who changed culture did so in the face of skepticism. When Thomas Edison was told he'd failed 1,000 times, he reframed it. He hadn't failed. He discovered 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb. That is the mindset of someone who refuses to let doubt define them. They don't deny its existence. They reframe it into something useful. So when people tell you it can't be done, smile inwardly and think, thank you. Because in that moment, they've just handed you fuel, and fuel, when directed, creates fire. The fire that pushes you to wake up earlier, to work harder, to persist longer. Without that fire, you might quit when things get difficult, but with it, you become unstoppable. The paradox of doubt is that it can either kill your spirit or ignite it. The choice is always yours. You can absorb their disbelief and carry it as a weight, or you can use it as a reason to rise higher. Every time someone underestimates you, you are given an opportunity, an invitation, really, to prove them wrong. So when you hear that voice, whether external or internal, whispering, don't argue, don't explain, don't defend, just let your work answer, let your persistence answer, let your results answer. That is the most powerful form of proof. Because in the end, the people who doubt you are not the real problem. The real problem is whether you choose to believe them. And here's the closing thought. Doubt in its rawest form is nothing more than energy. And energy is neutral until you decide what to do with it. If you let it break you, it becomes destruction. But if you let it drive you, it becomes transformation. Take their doubt, turn it into fuel, and burn so brightly that the very people who said you couldn't will one day have no choice but to stand in the light of what you've achieved. When you decide to prove people wrong, when you take their doubt and convert it into fuel, you'll quickly discover something unsettling. Motivation doesn't last. Motivation is intoxicating in the moment. You hear a cutting remark. You feel the sting of disbelief. And suddenly you're on fire with determination. But that fire left to itself burns out. The world is littered with people who were motivated for a week, for a month, for a season, and then slipped back into the very mediocrity they swore they'd escape. That's why the next step is crucial. You must build unshakable discipline. Discipline is the bridge between desire and achievement. It is the structure that holds your vision upright when emotions collapse. Most people misunderstand discipline. They think of it as punishment, as drudgery, as some cruel denial of pleasure. But discipline is not punishment, it is self-respect. It is the recognition that your life is too valuable to be left at the mercy of moods and whims. If you only act when you feel like it, you are a slave to circumstance. If you act because you have chosen to, regardless of whether you feel like it or not, you become free. Freedom is not the absence of rules. Freedom is the ability to live according to principles you have set for yourself. That is discipline. There's a psychological principle at work here that cannot be ignored. Human beings are creatures of habit, and habit is destiny. The small actions you repeat daily carve the shape of your future, in ways you often don't see until years have passed. This is why discipline matters. It turns intention into habit, and habit into character. You don't become someone remarkable through a single burst of effort. You become remarkable through thousands of quiet, consistent decisions that compound into strength. Now, some people will say, I'm just not disciplined. I don't have that personality. That's an excuse disguised as honesty. Discipline is not a trait you're born with. It's a muscle you develop. Nobody is naturally disciplined. Every person who looks disciplined to you simply trained themselves to do hard things repeatedly until those things became easier. And here's the paradox. The more you practice discipline, the freer you become. The less you rely on motivation, the more unstoppable you are. Think of it this way. A motivated person runs when the sun is shining and the mood is high. A disciplined person runs in the rain, in the cold, when no one is watching, when every fiber of their body says, stay home. And that difference is everything. Because life will not wait for perfect conditions, and if you wait for them, you will never move forward. Philosophically, discipline ties into something much deeper, the idea of sacrifice. Every act of discipline is a form of sacrifice. You are giving up comfort now for strength later, ease now for meaning later. That is why all great traditions, religious and philosophical, emphasize discipline. They recognize that without sacrifice, life becomes shallow, and with it, life becomes purposeful. To build discipline is to accept that growth requires cost, but it is also to realize that the cost is worth it because the reward is a self you respect. You consider the alternative. A life without discipline is a life ruled by impulse, and impulses, left unchecked, drag you into chaos. They keep you scrolling when you should be working, eating when you should be fasting, sleeping when you should be striving. And the more you give in, the weaker you become, until one day you realize you are no longer living your life. You are being lived by it. Discipline is the antidote. It is the declaration that you are not a victim of your desires, but the master of them. This mastery is not about rigidity. It's not about becoming a machine. It's about aligning your daily actions with your higher vision so that every step takes you closer to the person you are meant to be. And once that alignment is established, people's doubt becomes almost irrelevant. Because while they're still talking, still predicting your failure, you're moving, you're working, you're quietly stacking bricks day after day, until one day there stands a fortress where they thought there would only be ruins. The discipline itself becomes proof. When people see you consistently showing up, consistently building, consistently refusing to quit, their words lose power. Your actions drown them out, and that's the point. Proving them wrong isn't about dramatic gestures. It's about the quiet strength of discipline lived out over time. Ask yourself, what could you accomplish if you showed up for Senbite Lo days straight, no excuses? What would your life look like if you stopped negotiating with yourself and started obeying the standards you set? The answer should both terrify and inspire you. Terrify because it reveals how much potential you've wasted. Inspire because it shows how much potential you still have. Discipline then is not just a strategy, it's a moral obligation. You owe it to yourself to live with enough structure to make your potential real. You owe it to those who doubted you to show them what persistence looks like. You owe it to the people who silently look to you for hope, because whether you realize it or not, someone is always watching you, wondering if greatness is possible for them too. And the best way to answer is not through words, but through the consistency of your actions. So let me leave you with this thought. Motivation is a spark, but discipline is the fire that keeps burning long after the spark fades. If you want to prove them wrong, stop relying on the highs of inspiration and start building the lows of habit. Because when you are disciplined, when you act in alignment with your vision, regardless of how you feel, you cannot be stopped. And here is the closing truth. Discipline is not chains, it is wings. And once you build it, no doubt, no criticism, no obstacle can keep you from flying. If discipline is the structure that carries you forward, then failure is the landscape you must travel across. And make no mistake, you will fail. There is no serious pursuit in life that does not carry failure along with it. People often imagine success as a straight line, one continuous climb upward, but that's a lie. Success is jagged, uneven, marked by falls, delays, and dead ends. Failure is not an interruption of the path, it is the path. And if you don't learn to redefine it, if you treat it only as a verdict of incompetence, you will stop long before you reach the summit. The irony is that the people who doubt you are counting on your failure. They expect you to stumble, and when you do, they'll nod knowingly as if the outcome was inevitable. They'll say, "See, I told you so." But what they don't understand is that failure only destroys those who misunderstand it. For the wise, failure is not destruction. It's information. It's the world giving feedback, revealing weaknesses, pointing out where you are unprepared. Every failure contains within it the seeds of transformation. If you're willing to look closely, psychologically, we tend to equate failure with shame. That's because from childhood, we're taught that mistakes are something to avoid. Get the wrong answer in school, and you feel embarrassed. Drop the ball in a game, and your teammates groan. That conditioning runs deep. By the time we're adults, we associate failure with inadequacy, and inadequacy with worthlessness. But here's the reality. Failure is not evidence that you are worthless. It is evidence that you are attempting something beyond your current limits. And that's precisely how growth works. If you never fail, it means you're not aiming high enough. You're staying safely within the boundaries of what you already know you can do. But greatness is never found within safety. Greatness requires risk, and risk guarantees failure. The philosopher John Stuart Mill once argued that genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. And freedom, in this sense, means the freedom to fail again and again without accepting it as the final word. Think about how children learn to walk. They fall constantly, and yet nobody calls them failures. Why? Because we intuitively understand that falling is part of walking. But the same logic applies to every pursuit in life. When you attempt something meaningful, stumbling is not a deviation. It is practice. Each fall is teaching your body, your mind, your character what is required to stand stronger the next time. The people who doubt you want to weaponize your failures against you. They want you to believe that every mistake proves them right. But the truth is, every mistake proves you're still in the arena. And being in the arena matters more than sitting on the sidelines predicting outcomes. The critic risks nothing. The doubter risks nothing. But the one who dares, the one who acts, inevitably fails. And in that failure is the raw material for eventual triumph. There's a deeper philosophical point here. Failure introduces humility, and humility is essential because it clears away illusions. Success without failure breeds arrogance. It tricks you into thinking you're infallible. But failure humbles you, grounds you, forces you to confront the reality of your limitations. That confrontation, painful as it is where wisdom begins. You realize you are not omnipotent, not untouchable, and precisely in that realization you learn where to grow. You look at history's innovators. Edison, when asked about his thousands of failed attempts to create a light bulb, famously reframed them as discoveries. He hadn't failed, he had simply found thousands of ways that didn't work. That's not just clever rhetoric, it's a disciplined philosophy of progress. The failures were not detours, they were data. And once you adopt that mindset, failure loses its sting. It becomes something you can handle, something you can use. But make no mistake, this reframing requires courage. It's far easier to collapse under failure, to interpret it as a sign you should quit. That's why so few persist. They experience failure, feel the sting of shame, and retreat to safety. But the ones who succeed, those who truly prove their doubters wrong, don't interpret failure as evidence of their incapacity. They interpret it as a test of their endurance, as proof they are still on the path. Here's the challenge. When you fail, don't hide it, don't deny it, and don't wallow in it. And study it, break it apart, ask, what did this reveal about me? Where was I unprepared? What needs to change? That process transforms failure from a dead end into a map. And if you repeat this process long enough, you will find yourself not only moving forward, but doing so with a resilience that no critic can break. There is also a paradoxical power in failure. It builds credibility. The more times you fall and rise again, the harder it becomes for people to dismiss you. They may not respect your results immediately, but they will begin to respect your persistence. And persistence in time creates results that are undeniable. So when you stumble, don't curse the ground. Don't internalize the voices of those who expected you to fall. Instead, remember this: failure is simply proof that you are in motion, that you are daring, that you are alive in the pursuit of something greater than comfort. And here's the closing thought: failure is not the opposite of success, it is the foundation of it. Every failure you endure is a stone in the staircase of achievement. If you stop climbing, you stay on the ground. But if you keep stepping, no matter how many times you trip, eventually the staircase will lift you to a place your doubters never imagined possible. All along the way, through the doubt you've turned into fuel, through the discipline you've built, through the failures you've reframed, there will still be voices. Some will whisper, some will shout, and some will linger in your own head long after others have stopped speaking. And if you spend your life trying to argue with those voices, trying to prove your worth with words, you will waste energy that should be directed toward your work. At some point, you have to understand this: the only response that truly matters is success itself. Words are cheap. Explanations are fragile. You can defend yourself endlessly. You can debate and justify and plead for people to understand, but rarely will that change their perception. People believe what they see, not what they are told. And when you achieve something undeniable, when the results are visible and tangible, those results silence the critics more powerfully than any rebuttal ever could. There is a kind of psychological trap in wanting to convince others along the way. You tell yourself, if they just understood me, if they just knew how hard I'm working, if they could only see my heart, they'd respect me. But here's the truth: many won't. They don't have the time, the vision, or the humility to recognize what you're building until it's finished. And even then, some will cling to their skepticism. But that's irrelevant, because your task is not to persuade them with talk. It is to make your life itself the argument. There's a biblical phrase that comes to mind: by their fruits you shall know them. Not by their intentions, not by their excuses, not even by their dreams, by their fruits, by the tangible outcomes of their labor. That principle is universal. A tree can boast about how strong it is, but until it bears fruit, those words are hollow. In the same way, your success must become the fruit of your labor, the undeniable evidence that no amount of doubt or dismissal could prevent you from becoming what you were meant to become. Success does not mean flaunting. It's not about rubbing your achievements in someone's face. It's not about ego or revenge. It's about letting the outcome of your persistence stand as its own testimony. Because real success speaks with a quiet authority. It doesn't need to scream. It simply exists, and its existence is proof. The very people who doubted you may never apologize. Philosophically, this ties back to the idea of logos, but their silence will be the acknowledgement and truth. And you won't need more than that. When your life aligns with discipline, resilience, and consistent effort, the results are not accidental. They are inevitable. And inevitability is stronger than argument. An argument can be dismissed, a philosophy can be ignored, but an undeniable reality cannot be denied forever. You become the proof. But here's the deeper challenge: success cannot just be defined externally. If you define it only by applause, recognition, or wealth, then you're still chained to the opinions of others. That's not freedom, that's dependency dressed up as achievement. Real success is measured first internally. Did you do what you said you would do? Did you persist when it was easier to quit? Did you grow stronger, wiser, more capable than you were before? If the answer is yes, then the success is already complete, regardless of whether the doubters ever notice. At the same time, external success matters because it manifests the invisible into the visible. It turns potential into proof. And this is where the voices of doubt finally lose their grip. Because the critic can say you're incapable, but they cannot deny the business you built, the degree you earned, the art you created, the body you transformed, the family you raised, the evidence becomes its own defense. It's worth noting that some of the most powerful successes in history began as responses to doubt. The Wright brothers were mocked for thinking humans could fly. Scientists dismissed them. Newspapers ridiculed them. But they didn't argue, they built. And when the first plane lifted off the ground, there was no more debate. The achievement itself ended the conversation. That is the model. Don't waste your energy on arguments. Spend it on building something undeniable. This is not only about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. Deep down, beneath the noise of other people's opinions, there's a quieter voice within you that asks, am I capable? That's the most important critic you'll ever face. And the answer to that question is not given in speeches, not in self-justification, but in the results of your actions. When you achieve what once seemed impossible, that inner voice quiets, and you don't just prove them wrong, you prove to yourself that you were stronger than you thought. So the final call is this: stop wasting time explaining, stop begging to be believed, stop carrying the burden of other people's disbelief. Focus instead on the work. Build the habits, embrace the failures, persist through the darkness, and let the outcome rise as a monument that speaks for you. Because when you succeed, when your results stand tall and undeniable, there will be no need for words. The people who doubted you will fade into the background, the critics will fall silent, and your life itself will stand as the loudest, clearest response. And here is the closing truth. Let your success speak, not your anger, not your defense, not your excuses. Because in the end, the loudest voice is not the one that argues, it's the one that achieves.